Welcome back, everybody, to Biology B. I'm going to be covering the second half of the Unit 3.8 Waste Removal and Obtaining Oxygen lesson. The learning targets we're going to focus on is to explain the process of obtaining and distributing oxygen in representative organisms. We're going to cite specific examples from their anatomy. So the big idea illustrated is that we're focusing on body systems of 3 representative organisms because we can't compare every living organism out there. So we're going to be using flatworms to represent all organisms that are invertebrates. They don't have a vertebral column. Plants, basic plant, I'm not making anything specific. And then humans. We are going to be covering technically the respiratory system today, although understand that not all of these representative organisms have a respiratory system the way that we do. This big idea slide, I think, is important to reiterate to you because since we're talking about the respiratory system, oxygen is tied into a lot of these processes here, like photosynthesis. The waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen. And the part that we need to make cellular respiration happen needs oxygen. So this is sort of why it's so important that we're covering obtaining oxygen at all as it relates to a respiratory system. So I'm going to start with plants. How do plants obtain oxygen? Well, they don't have a standard respiratory system that we would consider. So they do need oxygen. And if you remember, they go through the same process that all other living things go through that needs oxygen. So plants need oxygen in order to undergo cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is a fancy way of saying taking glucose and converting it into ATP. And you need oxygen to do that because if you consider cellular respiration, like the process of burning something, burning glucose in this case, you have to have oxygen for fire to happen. So it's the same concept. They obtain oxygen in 2 ways. They can produce it during their own photosynthesis process. So they release it for us, thank goodness, through these stomata if there's a buildup of oxygen in the system. But they can also pull it in from these stomata as well if maybe there's a period where there's not a lot of sun and they don't really photosynthesize as much as they would in other times of the year. So there are 2 ways that they can get oxygen through their own cellular process of photosynthesis or to pull it in from the atmosphere through their stomata. Flatworms, by comparison, are a little bit more complicated. Where is the flatworm's mouth? Well, we talked about the parts of the flatworm when we talked about the digestive system. And part of the digestive system and the excretory system, and in this case, we're going to reference it here, is the pharynx. A pharynx is a fancy word for throat. The end of that would be the mouth. So it's technically the end of the pharynx or throat. The next question we need to lead from that is, where does that go to? So if this is their version of our mouth, then where are their lungs? Do you see any lungs on this organism? We see this cavity here, which we discussed as the digestive system, is called the gastrovascular cavity. So that's where the pharynx leads, and that's for digestion. That's where the food goes. But there are no lungs that we can see, no lungs proper per se, that you would feel in your chest as you take a big breath in. Your chest expands because your lungs are expanding, but there are no lungs No lungs in flatworms. So the answer there will be no. No lungs. So if flatworms don't have lungs, how do they obtain oxygen? By diffusion across their skin or body. So just like when we discuss diffusion across a cell membrane, it's very similar to that. The oxygen in this organism's environment, which is usually watery, will just diffuse across that barrier that is technically its skin and diffuse into the cellular tissues. Remember, this is a pretty small organism, so it doesn't need a really complicated system to begin with. How do fish obtain oxygen? Do they have lungs? If you don't fish or out in the wild on a lake very often, you may not know the answer to this, but you do know that fish have these things on the side of their neck, okay? And you see them flapping when you pull them out of the water. So fish do not have lungs. So the correct answer is no, they don't have lungs. Fish use their gills to filter oxygen out of the water. Hello. And they have to keep those gills moving in order to keep the circulation of water flowing through them. We wanted to take a minute here because respiration is so complicated across a lot of different organisms that we wanted to include at least one other representative. So next we're going to talk about how reptiles, amphibians, and mammals, all things with lungs, obtain oxygen. They usually have some kind of complicated respiratory system where oxygen enters the nose and the mouth, travels through the trachea, moves to the lungs where there's things called bronchi and bronchioles and tiny sacs at the end called alveoli. You don't need to know all of these small parts of this respiratory system. What you do need to know is that oxygen and carbon dioxide travel from the bloodstream into this system. The other system that's often connected with this respiratory system is the circulatory system. So red blood cells and the heart are involved in transporting all of these oxygen molecules. So you don't need to know all these parts, but just to understand that oxygenated blood travels from the lungs to the heart, from the heart to the body, and then back from the heart through the body to the lungs. Which of the following best summarizes the reasons living things depend on oxygen? What do we use oxygen for? And what does every organism that's alive depend on oxygen for? Well, it's not digestion. And although it's an element of water, it's not relevant here. And it's not involved in protein production. Again, oxygen is used during cellular respiration. Okay, so we're going to just wrap up what we just learned about the respiratory system, i.e. obtaining oxygen, by filling in these parts here on this big picture scale. So I am a very visual learner. I think a lot of you are as well. When we talk about the respiratory system in flatworms, it's basically non-existent. What did we talk about for how flatworms obtain oxygen? Well, oxygen and carbon dioxide is diffused through the skin. I want to go in here and add the word and oxygen because I realized I hadn't put that in there. Transfer gas exchange across their skin. Diffusion is the word. For plants, they don't have a quote unquote respiratory system, but they have a series of organelles and the structure on their leaf called stomata, which you could use to represent parts of the system. So they bring in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen, and they can use the oxygen from photosynthesis. The other way to bring it in again is through their stomata, those holes in the leaves. Don't forget that fish don't have lungs. What they have are a series of flaps on the side of their bodies by their face, and they're called gills. And the gills filter the water for oxygen. For humans and other animals, they remove carbon dioxide and take in oxygen through lungs, and the rest of the respiratory system doesn't matter the details, but they're also piggybacked to the circulatory system because the circulatory system drives oxygen collected from the lungs through the body to the different body tissues. And that's all I have for this lesson today. I hope that this overview helps and that when you're studying for your test, you're looking at this as the big picture. Good luck. I will talk to you at our next lesson.